It's a pleasure to introduce the presenters this evening. Dan Rothstein is co-director of the Right Question Institute. He is co-author with Liz Santana of Make Just One Change, Teach Students to Ask Their Own Questions, the book which first introduced the question formulation technique. Dan's work focuses on honoring and supporting the work of 200,000 educators who are driving a movement in urban, suburban, and rural communities to help students learn to ask better questions and take more ownership of their own learning. Dan has a doctorate from the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And Andrew P. Minigan is the Right Question Institute's Education Project and Research Coordinator. He leads the Sir John Templeton Foundation-funded Million Classrooms campaign, which aims to nurture student curiosity and cultivate critical thinking skills through the use of the question formulation technique in 1 million classrooms. Andrew has an education master's in human development and psychology from the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Welcome, Dan and Andrew, and take it away.
I would just like to thank the Library of Congress for this great opportunity. And we have Twitter, and please feel free to follow us. We offer many resources and materials on our website, www.rightquestion.org, and this helps support the work of the educators who are using the QFT. We'd also like to thank the Sir John Templeton Foundation and the Hummingbird Fund for the support of the Million Classrooms campaign. And again, I'd like to thank the Library of Congress for inviting us to do this webinar. And I'd like to now introduce Dan, who will be sharing how this work began and the start of the work in Lawrence, Massachusetts.
Great to be here. Tonight we'll have a chance to look at addressing a fundamental challenge in education, that students are not asking questions, a chance to experience the question formulation technique, to see examples of classroom use in students' questions, have a chance to identify the value of teaching students to ask questions, and reflect on different ways to use the question formulation technique. Our work began more than 20 years ago when Liz Santana and I and several other people were working in Lawrence, Massachusetts. And we learned from parents that we were working on a dropout prevention program, and our role was to try to engage more parents to participate in their children's education. And the parents told us, we don't go to the schools because we don't even know what to ask. So we thought we had a solution to that. We could come up with a list of questions. But what they actually named was the more fundamental problem, is that the ability to ask one's own questions, to know how to organize your thinking around things that you're not familiar with, that you don't know, is really the key challenge. So what we really needed to do was really to look at how do we teach that skill. So we began our work working with parents, and ASCD recently published a book on our strategy for working with parents to get them more involved as partners with educators in their children's education. We also began to work in healthcare, and we saw a National Institutes of Health study that showed a doubling and tripling of patient activation and engagement when they used the question formulation technique. It began to be noticed by people in the private sector. In Warren Berger's book, A More Beautiful Question, he featured the strategy as a way to promote innovation. And we also began to use the strategy with voter engagement efforts for people to begin to learn to ask questions about decisions and elections that affect them. So we began to then hear from other people who were also acknowledging the significance of the importance of learning to ask your own questions. And Stuart Firestein, a professor at Columbia University, wrote a beautiful book called Ignorance, How It Drives Science. And he said that his graduate students come in and they see a 1,400-page textbook and they think that's all that there is to know. But actually, he said, that simply is what we know. What we don't know is much greater. So our students really need to learn how to think in questions, how to manage ignorance. College presidents were asked by the New York Times, what should students learn in college? Leon Botstein said, Bard College said the primary skills should be analytical skills of interpretation and inquiry. In other words, know how to frame a question. Nancy Cantor, at the time the chancellor of the University of Illinois, said, the best we can do for students is to have them ask the right questions. What do college students say about what they learned in school? In college, barely a quarter of them say that they really learned, that they were taught how to ask their own questions. But the problem clearly begins long before college. So take a moment and look at this slide here. You see a generally upward slope of basic skill attainment in reading and writing. There's still a lot of work to keep it moving further up, but you see a generally upward slope. Then look at this next slide. That yellow line is the line of asking questions. And you see a general decline from the age of 4, just about when students are entering school, and it declines all the way down to maybe a quarter of students actively asking questions by the time they finish high school. So our work and the work that we can do together is on changing the direction of that slope. And we're not alone. There are more than 200,000 educators around the world now using the strategy of the question formulation technique that we will explore in depth tonight. And they're doing it without any mandate or requirement because it solves a problem that they see in front of them every day. And that's the problem that we're going to work on together. So what happens when students learn to ask their own questions? Well, John Hattie's research shows that self-questioning as a metacognitive strategy improves students' rate of learning by nearly 50%. This is a very significant gain and very significant indication of how important the skill is. Students' questions then serve as a catalyst for their curiosity, for greater engagement, for more ownership of their learning, and leads to deeper learning. And what do students say? Students talk about just when you think you know all you need to know, you ask another question and discover how much more there is to learn. That's what a 6th grade student said in California, that sense of discovery. Now here's another student who's in a high school in Boston who said, when you ask the question, you feel like it's your job to get the answer. So imagine that. Imagine you have your students in front of you and they're excited because they've discovered another question and they discover how much more there is to learn, exactly what Professor Firestein at Columbia University had mentioned. And then you have a student who says he feels like it's his job to get the answer. Think about what that would mean if your students were feeling that all the time. Students in this process of using the question formulation technique learn to produce their own questions, learn to improve their questions, strategize on how to use their questions, and learn to reflect on what they've learned. So now we're going to take a moment to have a quick exercise in the question formulation technique. It's your turn. So we're going to start with basic rules for producing questions. And look at these 4 rules. Ask as many questions as you can. Do not stop to answer, judge, or discuss. Write down every question exactly as stated and change any statements into questions. Those are 4 rules. We often ask people to spend a little time thinking about what might be difficult about following these rules. People have a good discussion and they think about what might be difficult, but they're all set to follow the rules. And then we ask, okay, which rule are you going to violate first? And people kind of laugh and then they realize that they're going to have trouble not stopping to answer, judge, or discuss them. And so they kind of are aware that these can be difficult to follow. But for the purpose of our exercise, we're going to ask you to do the best you can on your own to be following these rules. So here's your focus. Some students are not asking good historical questions. What are your questions about that? As you're sitting there thinking, ask as many questions as you can. Don't edit yourself. Just get them down there. I have to tell you, this is a very painful thing for me to ever have to cut anybody off from asking questions, but I got to do it. We've got a time limit. So we're going to move on. I want you to get through the whole process. There's a lot more coming, a lot of good things coming. Okay, so now let's take a moment and look at closed and open-ended questions. Closed-ended questions can be answered with a yes or no or with a one-word answer, and open-ended questions require more explanation. What I'd like you to do is to think about the questions that you asked and identify some closed-ended ones and some closed-ended and open-ended ones. So let's move on to the next step. Think for a moment about closed-ended questions. What are some advantages of closed-ended questions? Now let's think for a moment about closed-ended questions and what are some disadvantages to closed-ended questions. So we're going to move on to the next step. Let's look at open-ended questions. What are some advantages to open-ended questions? And what are some disadvantages to open-ended questions? Okay, so we're going to move on to the next step because there's more to share, more to learn. So let's take a moment and take one of your closed-ended questions. Take any of the ones that you've seen, a closed-ended question, change it into an open-ended question, and take one open-ended question and change it into a closed-ended question. Okay, so let's move on now to the next step in the process. We've produced questions using 4 rules to produce lots of questions. Then you began to look more closely at your questions and look at closed and open and closed, and you practice changing from one kind to the other. And now let's move on to the next step here. Let's take a look at questions that you have and choose 2 questions that strike you as that you consider most important. And while prioritizing and thinking about those 2 questions, think about the original question focus that I gave you. Some students are not asking good historical questions. So let's see if we can get questions and in question form 2 questions that you consider most important. Okay, there's a lot going on here. Again, I can't tell you how much pain this brings me to have to cut off this great thinking, but we're going to continue to do thinking together, but on to the next step. So let me take you to the next step after you've prioritized the questions. I want you to think for a moment about why you chose those questions as your priority questions, and to think about, in this case, you don't have the entire sequence in front of you, but think about, you may have a sense of when in the original list of questions did that priority question come from. Was it the beginning? Was it the middle? Towards the end? Just if you have some sense of that, why don't you share that? Why did you choose the priority questions that you chose, and where did they come from in your original list? Okay, so there's a lot of analysis here and reflection on where did they come from, and explain the rationale for choosing them, and getting a sense of where they came from the original work with questions. So let's move on to the next step. We're going to move into reflection. And what I'd like you to do now is to stop for a moment and think about, in this exercise in which you produced questions, you worked on changing and improving your questions, and you prioritized your questions, and you thought about why you chose those questions and where they came from. What did you learn? And how did you learn it? So what we're going to do now is we're going to take a quick peek inside the black box. The question formulation technique had several components. Let's take a quick look at what actually happens when you go through that process. So the real contribution of the question formulation technique to student learning and to pedagogy is that there are 3 thinking abilities with one process. And you start off with the rules for producing questions that allow students to do something that very often is one of the most difficult things for them to do, and that is divergent thinking. They may come up with one idea, one question, and then shrug the shoulder and say, that's all I got. But the rules create space and allow for students to begin to push themselves to produce more questions. That divergent thinking step is really critical for helping them begin to open up different pathways of thinking. But it doesn't stop there, because when the students start to move into looking at their open and closed-ended questions and how to change them, they very often discover that the way you ask a question can yield different kinds of information. Now that's a huge discovery. And so they're beginning to become more sophisticated thinkers. They're more sophisticated question askers. But it doesn't stop there. Then they go on to prioritize their questions. And in prioritizing, very often, they discover that they can't answer question number 2, the second question that came up, until they've answered question number 9. And then they realize that they have never before in their lives come up with 9 questions. That actually, having done that work, led to a question that they understood was very important that they needed to address. So this is another major discovery. But it doesn't stop at convergent thinking either. There's another thinking ability that is going on when they're using the question formulation technique, and that's metacognition. Because from the very outset, we would start off by asking students to think about what might be difficult in following the rules. And the discussion that you would hear from that is always very interesting as they realize that there are different pieces of that are asking them to act in a way that they're not necessarily accustomed to doing, which is hearing a question and asking another question rather than stopping to answer it or discuss it. So that metacognition starts at the very beginning. It continues when they're thinking about open and closed, advantages and disadvantages of both kinds of questions. That's a new way of thinking about it. It continues when they're asked to explain the rationale for why they chose their priority questions. And of course, it concludes with the reflection, where students get to do something that they rarely have an opportunity to do, which is to name what they learned by working with their own questions and to think about how they learned what they learned. So this is a really amazing process that allows students to become very sophisticated question askers and thinkers in a very short period of time. So what we have seen is example after example. It's been so inspiring and exciting, and even from last year's webinar, we had people who participated in this webinar last year who went off and did great things with the question formulation technique, and this was the source for them going off and doing that. And we have continued to learn from the great work that's being done in the field. So we're going to share with you now some classroom examples so that you can see what teachers and students are doing with this. The first one is an example of from Joshua Beer's 8th grade history class in Leominster, New Hampshire, and the topic was American imperialism. And he used the question formulation technique for a very special purpose, for summative assessment. His question focus that he presented to his class, and the class was already experienced in using the question formulation technique, so they already were very skilled at it, and they had already done a whole unit on American imperialism at the end of the 20th century. So his question focus was simply questions that should be asked about American imperialism at the turn of the 20th century. And let's look at some of their priority questions. Number 2. Why did the Hawaiian natives and Queen Liliuokalani not want the United States to annex Hawaii? Very specific fact related to the end of at the end of 19th century American imperialism. Look at number 10. How did the Spanish-American War affect America? An interesting question that's about a specific event, but then looking at what its impact is. And then look at the question that's listed there as number 12, which actually was connected to the original question number 6 and was one that they changed in the process. So it didn't even exist on their original list of questions. And it was, why did Alfred Thayer Mahan have the stance that he did on imperialism? So they're looking at basically one of the intellectual leaders in the, around the idea of imperialism, and they were able to look at his work and say, this is a question that somebody who's knowledgeable about American imperialism should be able to answer. So there was a lot of work done just with their questions. Now let's take a quick look at an example from his classroom. That's an excerpt from a video that's on our website and is also in an article that we wrote, that Andrew and I and Luz wrote for Educational Leadership last year. We're going to take a look at a classroom example from Maureen Bennett, Lexington, Massachusetts, 3rd grade history unit on the Mayflower Compact, and it's an introduction to a unit on pilgrims. So here's her question focus. Maureen presented them with the Mayflower Compact. They were looking at it individually on their iPads, and they spent some time reading it, and then they got to work asking questions. And they asked some very specific questions about words that were in the compact. And then look at question number 5. Did the Indians sign it? So that was their first question that they changed from closed to open. They changed it from did the Indians sign it to how many Indians sign it? Then look at the next question that provoked. Did the Pilgrims sign it? They decided to change that as well. Who signed it? And then they asked this question very specific to the compact on who is Lord James, and they changed that as well. Was Lord James asking what is furtherance? So they really did an interesting prioritization here, and they got to questions that were very significant and related to issues of autonomy and participation and collective agreement, and thinking about who might agree, who might not agree, who might sign it, who might not sign it. So there was a lot of very sophisticated thinking that was going on by looking at this very difficult text. I should tell you what Maureen said is that what she said is after they asked those questions at the beginning of the unit, she was struck how that year the students kept on discovering as they moved further ahead in this is, oh, this relates to the question I asked about this. This relates to the priority question we had about who signed it and who didn't sign it. So they kept on revealing new layers of meaning in their study of pilgrims and the pilgrims' entry into the area and the whole history of the exchange by having done that work originally with the question formulation technique. So let's look at this sixth grade history example where Megan Harville was introducing a unit on the Civil War. And she was about to give them a reading, but before she gave them a reading that they would start learning about the topic, this is the question focus that she used. All right, so what are sixth graders going to ask when they look at this photo? Why are they fighting? Are they fighting? Where were they? What started the fight? Who are they? Were they signing anything? Who else was there? Why are you hitting him? It's a great middle school question. Why didn't they call 911? And then right after that they asked, was this related to slavery? And they went all the way through, including getting to number 15, which is another good middle school question, who hit who first? But then the questions, number 17, who died? And number 18, why are they smiling? And that why they're smiling is very significant because it shows a level of attention to a primary source that is really significant, because it's something that probably many of us might have missed. But what does it mean that those men in the background there are smiling? And they asked that question. They got to that question at question number 18. So it shows you the level of attention that and the ability to analyze primary sources that students are able to do if given the opportunity to ask questions. Now, Andrew's going to share with you an example from a high school history class.
Hi, everyone. So this is another example from Kelly Grotrian, an 11th grade U.S. history teacher from East Brunswick, New Jersey. Students were beginning to learn about the end of World War II, and she used the QFT, so students were actually generating their own questions ahead of the discussion. And the discussion was going to be centered around the question whether the U.S. was justified in dropping the atomic bomb. And students were also going to use these same questions for a homework assignment via Google Classroom. And so here was the question focus that Kelly presented to our 11th grade students. And here are some of the questions that they asked. Students began by asking, what is this? And then the second question, who did this? Students quickly moved into inquiring about the impact of the event depicted in the primary source. How did this affect people? And question 4, what were the environmental and economic implications of dropping the bomb? In question 6, you can see a student makes a very interesting and nuanced observation of something in the lower right-hand corner. Is that a plane wing in the bottom right? This prompts the next student question. Did the people in that plane drop the bomb? And question 8, an ethical question. Did the people dropping the bomb know what they were doing? In question 10, a student asks who was responsible for dropping the bomb. Then to question 11, a question about cause. What led to this event? And question 12, a question about effect. What happened as a result of dropping this bomb? Students' questions about cause and effect, including effects like that mentioned in question 17, where a student asks how many lives were lost as a result, stimulate this type of student thinking that Kelly was trying to get from the students, and it led directly to where she was planning for the lesson to go, to have them start thinking about whether the U.S. was justified in dropping the atomic bombs. Now that you've seen some examples from Maureen Bennett in an elementary class, Megan Harville from a middle school class, and Kelly Grotrian from a high school class, I'd like to invite all of you to share how can the QFT be helpful when using primary sources in your classroom. So if you all want to take a minute and share, now that you've seen those examples, how you can use the QFT for teaching primary sources. And so we've learned a lot about how teachers are using the question formulation technique in their classroom. And in our article, which Dan mentioned earlier, Making Questions Flow, we discuss how it can be used to stimulate student interest and engagement at the beginning of a lesson, just as Megan Harville did with the Caning of Sumner example. It can be used to impart knowledge and help students start thinking about the information of a heavy text, of a historical text, such as the Mayflower Compact in Maureen Bennett's example. Educators have begun to use students' questions to better understand what students know or do not know. And teachers and librarians and educators all have also used the QFT as a summative assessment to kick off a research project or paper, or in Joshua Beer's example, actually using the students' questions as a part of a final exam on a unit on imperialism.
This is Dan again. I'd like to thank you, Andrew, for that really good example and analysis. I'd like to share with you some of what we are learning from teachers in the field and their use of the question formulation technique. And they have looked at what happens when they teach the three thinking abilities and see that it becomes something that they had not necessarily been aware of before, that they wanted to deliberately teach those abilities. But as they see students develop them through using the question formulation technique, they've come to understand how significant it is for students to acquire those abilities, and they begin to deliberately foster opportunities for them to practice those thinking abilities. So those teaching of the three thinking abilities actually now becomes a pedagogy. It becomes a distinct, deliberate way to help your students develop intellectually. Now, when students are using the three thinking abilities, something else is happening. It's actually a theory of learning. Because if you think about it, if you observe students in classroom and you see them doing divergent thinking, you see them do convergent thinking, and you see them doing metacognitive thinking, each one of which has been a great challenge to promote in many different environments, and you see them easily move through those thinking abilities, develop them, become more expert at using them, you really begin to see that this becomes an explanation of how students are learning by using these three thinking abilities. So Andrew's going to share with you, starting off, some final words that we have about putting students' minds into motion.
Thank you for that, Dan. So the name of the session, Questions Are the Engines of Intellect, How to Stimulate Student Curiosity and Questions. It's actually derived from a quote by famed historian David Hackett Fisher. And he said, questions are the engines of intellect, the cerebral machines which convert energy to motion and curiosity to controlled inquiry. And now, in the year 2015, what do students who learn how to ask their own questions say? Well, an 8th grade student from Austin, Texas, in James Brewster's history class reported that the QFT helps me by getting me to think about questions on my own. Also, it gets my mind in motion to think about the questions other people make.
Thank you, Andrew. That's quite a quote there, and to think about how it connects to David Hackett Fisher's quote and the title of this whole webinar, Questions Are the Engines of the Intellect, is really quite remarkable. So let's think for a moment about, in this age of Google, where students have access to quick answers, and they in some ways think that getting information is relatively easy because they can simply Google it. Let's look at that idea of the role of technology and learning. Clive Thompson, a really clever technology journalist, has written a great book called Smarter Than You Think: How Technology is Changing Our Minds for the Better. And he talked about how, since everybody has such access to information, and in the age of Google, there's so many resources available for quickly finding information. He said, well, how should you respond when you get powerful new tools for finding answers? And he concludes his entire book by saying, think of harder questions. So let's look at the skill of asking questions. The importance of the skill of asking questions is certainly for moving from ignorance to knowledge, for arriving at better answers, for increasing engagement and ownership, but it's for more as well. You can demonstrate inquiry in the classroom, and you can generate a little more joy for teachers in a very demanding profession as their students discover the joy of asking questions and setting a learning agenda. And then there's another reason, which is certainly relevant to the convener and of this entire conference and our webinar, the Library of Congress. It's connected to democracy. And if you look at this picture, in the center of this picture, you can see Septima Clark, who was a teacher in the Charleston, South Carolina school system. And after 18 years, in 1955, she was fired for being a member of the NAACP. So Septima and her cousin Bernice Robinson, who's standing behind her, a beautician, set up what they called citizenship schools to teach basic literacy to adults in the area. And Septima Clark did it not just because she wanted to make sure that they could prevent themselves from being cheated out of wages, and she wanted to be sure they could help themselves in various ways, but she also saw it as part of the larger project. She saw it in connection to democracy. She said, we need to be taught to study rather than to believe, to inquire rather than to affirm. So what Septima Clark managed to do is capture, in a sense, the real power of teaching students to ask their own questions. You're building citizens of the future. You're creating students who can become self-directed learners and who will discover new things, just as that student in California said, just when you think you've asked everything you need to ask, you discover a new question to ask, and it opens up whole new worlds. And those are the questions that are awaiting us when students learn how to ask their own questions. And I'd like you to know that we have pushed you quickly through this process. We are very grateful to the Library of Congress and Teaching with Primary Sources for this opportunity to share the question formulation technique with you. It was meant to give you a taste of it and a glimpse of how it can be used with primary sources. And it's great to see Mary Johnson on this on the webinar, because she really helped get the whole ball rolling in introducing the question formulation technique through the entire great network of Teaching with Primary Sources. So there are more resources on our website at writequestion.org. There are more videos. You can watch the full video that you saw the trailer from. And there are videos of different age levels, different subject areas. And we also invite you to help us promote the idea of students learning to ask their own questions, of helping build a democracy with citizens who are asking questions, and to be part of the Million Classrooms campaign.
I want to thank Dan and Andrew for a wonderful presentation and very inspiring, and thanks to everybody who attended the session.